So, just a few words of welcome coming from myself. Dear colleagues and dear friends, most of you are already friends, and the other I'm happy to welcome and to meet for the first time. Well, it's now my pleasure, indeed, in the name of us four, Stephen, Barbara, Jason and me, to finally thank you all for coming. I'm happy, really happy that you finally made it to this event. And I'm especially grateful, yes, to those who traveled from far away to Brussels. I must admit, indeed, that I never imagined our small Brussels conference would be so well attended. So thank you all again for being here today and tomorrow and on Friday. Several years ago, when I first had an idea to host a Norbert Elias conference here, Stephen took me at my word. And we began to think about it more seriously a bit later, I think in Vienna, in ISA Congress of Vienna in 2016. Why, at the end, an Elias conference in Brussels? Even though it's a central location, yes, it's supposed to be the capital or the heart of Europe. Mm-hmm. It's rainy as England or Ireland, and rather outside the place for Eliasian studies. But why not? Why not in Brussels? My only condition was to organize it together, collectively. And in this respect, I want to say that this conference, which came to be handmade in Brussels, just like chocolate, but chocolate is not made anymore handmade in Brussels, but handmade in Brussels, and I would dare made with love in Brussels. This conference has been an international teamwork from start to finish. And for me, personally, for this very reason, a most precious human experience, because it was a shared one with the very, very generous personalities sitting at this table. I feel proud and lucky, definitely lucky to know them, and happy to get to know them better during the past year through hundreds and hundreds of emails and memorable Skype meetings. The main inspiration behind organizing this conference was just and simply to offer an opportunity for the gathering of our community and enlarging the Elias family. Well, at the same time though, we also wanted to include some sessions on current and important political issues. I don't want to try to explain to the gathering of the best Elias readers and most distinguished professors in sociology and international relations. I don't want to try to explain why a conference focusing on politics. At least, as my friends and colleagues will do, and you, I suppose, I can try to illustrate why, in very simple words, why the political intuition at the heart of Elias' sociology always appeared to me so strongly, and even more and more so, from my own personal academic background, namely a political science one, and not a sociological one, but a political science one which is not normally interested in dividing of the social and political sciences. For me, an example of my major insight is given through this passage from the late text Change in the We-I Balance, 1987 text, the text we chose to highlight in our call and presentation. I'm quoting. We may or may not welcome the increasing integration of humankind. What is quite certain is that, to begin with, it increases the importance of the individual in relation to what is happening at the top level of humanity. In the same text, in the same late text, the European studies will find, if they want to, of course, powerful and stimulating hypotheses, presentiment and foreseeing fear and misery of the EU today, paving the way for a sociological and political analysis that finally should be able to fully recognize the inertia effect from past experience, the interdependence between domestic affairs and international politics, and the weight of affects, emotions, and feelings in politics as in social and national habitus. Please allow me to quote not Elias, neither one of us or you, but rather a PhD student in political science and European studies, who was very recently asked during her Viva why it should finally be necessary, useful, or even meaningful to investigate legitimacy issues at the EU level from a historical and sociological standpoint interested in the people. She said, rather provocatively, if I may reply in one word only, I would say Brexit. Brexit. Oh, Brexit. The B word. The B word. Well, I don't know at the end if we'll talk much about Brexit in the following few days. I think that we already did. Yeah. But we are convinced that we have not yet gave up the ground. That our shared sociological tradition has probably much to offer in order to elucidate such crucial political issues, be it by stepping back and looking at it from a more detached perspective, if even possible. What I find interesting is that instead of focusing on Brexit, because one conference on 3 here in Brussels here is on Brexit, what I find interesting is that instead of focusing only on Brexit, some of you chose to discuss the rise of populism or jihadism as specific forms of dangers entailed by the revival of certain fears, so strongly emphasized by Elias at the end of the civilizing process, 1939, so long before Lichtbeck. One can only hope that our program realized our wish, our common wish, to open new fields for discussion and to consolidate and enlarge more and more the existing research networks among Elias fellows and readers of all countries, different generations, and other disciplines. If I also may add, I would like to say that it has been really fascinating task to create a program from the 120 abstracts received, which revealed to me the full potential of Eliasian approaches and their diverse uses. Far from a purely exegetical conference, it aims, through many papers and several sessions, to establish a dialogue with sensible different theoretical and empirical perspectives. And I was particularly impressed by the real multi- and interdisciplinary range of papers which were proposed, including a re-established opening to the areas such as political theory and law, which was not something usual in the past. And well, I don't want to be longer, I just want to have the opinion of my colleagues about all that, and and maybe enlarge the discussion with all of us. But that was, in few words, what I wanted to say about our common objective of this conference and the background of it. Thank you.
Can I come in there?
It was just Barbara.
Oh, it was Barbara. I'm sorry to screw it completely up. But we had a meeting this morning. The Elias Foundation members had a meeting this morning, and they've asked me to say a few words. And I did want to say a huge thank you. It was a team who organised it, but very much, there are teams, folks, and there are teams where you've got someone who's doing all the legwork, and it really was Florence and Anne-Marie who did an incredible job. This conference started out as being quite a small thing, and very rapidly grew into this enormous thing. And I know from doing something similar at Leicester how much of an undertaking that was, how stressful it all is. And I think you've done a fantastic job. The other thing is just a quick reminder, I already spot in the audience a number of fellows, newly appointed fellows to the Norbert Elias Foundation from different linguistic regions, just to say that we've got a meeting on Friday at 12:30, in which we're going to be meeting with the fellows and having a drink together. And shortly, the last thing I was supposed to just sneak in there before we get into the meat of discussing the politics of figurational sociology.
Politics of fellows?
Well, politics of fellows could come into it as well. The last thing is to say that we had a long discussion about the new foundation website as well. And that's still very much a work in progress, but we hope to launch that over the next few months, and we'll be making an announcement about that in the future edition of Figurations. But if you haven't seen it already, look at norbertelias.com and have a look at some of the videos that have been uploaded. So I just wanted to get those in. But
typical Jason.
Can we give Florence a round of applause for a fantastic work?
I'm going to be very short and sweet as well. So since Jason already stole the floor, I'm going to take it back for a few minutes and I'll give it back to you again. I just want to say welcome and hello to everybody, and how I find it so incredible because this is not my first Elias conference, and I find it incredible how much our network is growing each time we meet again. And I'm very happy to see all the familiar faces, but I'm also very, very happy and amazed at how many new people keep coming back and keep coming, and they have amazing topics. I saw there's a whole plethora of different topics that are that will be presented over the next 2 days. And we want to do something a little bit different today during our opening of this conference. And I will pass the floor to Stephen and Jason. They will make some general remarks. But what we want to do, we want to hear from you too. Okay, so we want to have an open discussion and keeping the two main questions in mind. First of all, very broadly speaking, do you think that is it still wise and a good idea to have conferences like this focusing on one theorist only? Or are we heading towards this, and I use Stephen's phrase here, are we moving on too much into this ornamental sociology region maybe? And second of all, do you think that would Norbert Elias actually appreciate what we're doing here, and would he approve of those separate conferences that center on his ideas, or would he scold us and say, like, do your own work, do your own research, and move on? So I want you to keep this in mind, and Stephen and Jason will say a few things, but please, if you feel like you want to join the discussion, you're most welcome to do so. There will be a microphone there somewhere, so but it's not so big of a room, so I think we will hear each other anyway. So thank you and welcome.
My role in this organisation really was as a data bank and institutional memory, and I hope I made myself useful in that direction. But in the role of grand old man, or I don't like the old very much, but my memory goes back a long way, and I'd like to offer a few reflections. Taking up Barbara's point, is it in fact necessary to have meetings focusing so much on one theorist? And Elias would not have liked to be described just as a theorist. There is a risk, lots of risks, in our group being regarded as a cult, as I think it was said, not critically, but as a factual matter in the workshop earlier. This was much less of a problem way back in the 1970s, when everyone in sociology, and I guess also in the other social sciences, seemed to have pledged allegiance to a school. And the battle of the schools, which broke out in the 1970s, particularly in my own direct experience in Britain, did an enormous amount of damage to the discipline of sociology, if indeed it is still a single discipline. But the result is that, my view is that modern sociology has become very today-centred, or hodie-centric, as Johannes called it, and have run away from theory. So, fact is facts. It's a sort of Gradgrind kind of discipline at times, Gradgrind being a leading figure in one of Charles Dickens's novels. But it's actually, I think, almost unavoidable that we do have gatherings like this. As I wrote in the editor's note to the very first issue of the Figurations newsletter in 1994, we're just coming up to the 50th issue, by the way, which I think. I said it wasn't our plan to indulge in ancestor worship. And much as Norbert Elias admired the Chinese and Chinese civilization, he would not have much approved of ancestor worship. Why then is it necessary to have a long series of these gatherings? Well, in the early days, there were so very few of us. We sort of huddled together for warmth and protection. But there also had to be something like an organised campaign to promote interest in Elias's work, because those of us who were huddled together felt that he had something very important to say, including actually on politics, as you said. So we had to get him a hearing, which I think we have succeeded, even though we are by no means, we are, I suppose, in Troche's term, we are still to some extent, if not a sect, we are a denomination, but we have not yet become an all-encompassing church. In any case, Elias, as Norbert would have said, get on with, do your own thing, and did in fact tell me to do precisely that when I wanted to write a book about it. Well, I carried on anyhow. But his refusal of, his expressed hostility to the idea of founding a school, I think was a kind of false modesty. He didn't want to be the leader of a school within sociology, because his real ambition was not modest at all. It was to take over sociology and become the dominant voice, because he had a very strong idea about how sociology should be done. Besides all that, although he himself simply called himself a sociologist, he didn't mean by sociology that somewhat pedestrian and narrow discipline that has now become established in all too many universities. He was unfashionably an admirer of Auguste Comte, and when he spoke of sociology, he used the word in Comte's original sense of the queen of the sciences. And as Steve Loyal and Steve Quilly pointed out a few years ago, what Elias offered was what they call a workable synthesis, a central theory for the human sciences in the broadest sense, which may sound imperialistic, but I think it's true. Well, the overall theme of this conference, though, may appear to be more political science than sociology. But apart from those of us who worked in my case in departments of sociology in the narrow sense, participants in this conference include scholars in political science, international relations, criminology, psychology, history. I think there are some lawyers. All of us take our inspiration from. We got heckled.
Yeah. Coming from the gym.
I shall try to make myself clear. But whatever our technical affiliation within our universities, we all take a lot of inspiration from Elias. But we're all sociologists now, whether we are political scientists or sociologists or psychologists or whatever. I think that the last in a long series of Elias conferences is an absolutely essential forum, and I'm immensely grateful to Florence for daring to organise it, and you can stop worrying, it's going to be all right.
So, as ever, oh yeah. As ever, Stephen changed the rules halfway through our preparation for this session. This session was supposed to be interactive, off the cuff. We were going to be kind of interviewed by Florence about various issues related to the politics of figurational sociology. And then Stephen turns up with an A4 sheet with 6 points on it, with basically a little talk putting into it. And I didn't have a talk ready, so I've had to jot down a few ideas of my own. And they're really relating to this question of why a conference on Elias is potentially problematic. And it got me thinking about another question that I struggle with, which is why do some of my colleagues at Leicester and colleagues within the UK struggle with Elias? Why has there been this very mixed reception of Elias? And why are some people so hostile towards his work? And I think part of it links to this question of Elias's, not duplicity, but this kind of Janus-faced characteristic of Elias's work, which is that on the one hand, he looks extremely modest, laying a foundation, building small islands of certainty, etc., etc., etc. But on the other hand, he's incredibly ambitious, and that what he wants to do is really to generate a paradigm shift in sociology more generally. I've referred to this elsewhere as Elias transgressing the habits of good sociology. And that's obviously a play on the title of one of the books that Elias looked at, The Habits of Good Society. And what I'm suggesting by that is that there is a code of etiquette that operates within the social sciences and operates in particular within sociology. And that etiquette stipulates that you cannot elevate or privilege any one particular approach over and above that of any other. To do so risks this kind of absolute certainty that was destroyed in the wake of post-structuralism. So where are we now in sociology? I think we're in a position where there's an appetite increasingly for some sort of conceptual rebuilding and for some sort of conciliation between these multiple paradigms. A kind of response, a swing of the pendulum away from the paradigm wars of the 70s and the 1980s. What did Elias offer in this respect? Yes, it was more than just being another school amongst many. He was offering this idea of a workable synthesis, a central theory. And that central theory is often misunderstood. I think a central theory isn't meant to be a singular paradigm, but a theory that's couched at a central level. So if you think about central, meaning a kind of a central position between, on the one hand, absolute rationalism and absolute empiricism. So it's central in the sense that it's sufficiently detailed and tied to empirical observation to apply to a range of different discrete empirical cases, but at the same time general enough to apply, to link up the work of different people. If I do work on smoking, Eric did work, my supervisor Eric Dunning did work on football, and we were able to find links between our work through Elias's work. And this idea of a central theory, again, flies in the face of a tendency which is normal within the UK in particular, which is to deal with theory as a kind of specialism in its own right, and to work with a kind of divorce between theory and research. We can have theory without object. You know, I talk to some of my colleagues within the School of Management, and they see my attachment to Elias's theory as kind of touching, you know, and desperately out of date, because I should really be reading Deleuze and Guattari, and I should be investing in this kind of this elaborate conceptual vocabulary. And my response to that is there may well be some worth in Deleuze and Guattari and all the other theories that they're looking at. But actually, maybe what we should be looking at is a different way of doing sociology. And I think that's what Elias offers us. And I think that's what's so interesting about Elias's work, is that Elias is that some people read the civilizing process and they see a lot of empirical examples. Others look at it and see this kind of abstruse theory that it's difficult to extract from it. But the point, of course, is that Elias's work is always simultaneously theoretical and empirical. What he advances isn't just a paradigm, it's a different way of doing sociology, of doing research theorizing. And that, for me, is one of the most valuable things about it. The other thing to say is this kind of question of the politics of figurational sociology. So Elias kind of relegated politics to a future state, what Richard Kilminster calls the anticipatory motif of his work, where we develop sufficient small islands of certainty in the vast oceans of our ignorance to start to intervene in the sphere of human figuration in a manner that has a high degree of intended relative to unintended consequences. Wow, that's a real mouthful, but it captures, in essence, what Elias's position is. And there's a lot that my former colleague from Leicester, Steve Dunn, has criticised Elias in this respect, and my former colleague Chris Rojek has made the same criticism. That kind of is a bit of a cop-out because it means that you never have to do anything in the here and now as an Eliasian sociologist. And I can see Adamir's here, I can see Vera's here, and I went a couple of years ago to a conference in South America. And one of the really interesting things there was quite a few of the people who were talking about Elias and using Elias were using him as a kind of, almost like a progressive Marxian kind of way. And I thought that was really interesting, that kind of reading of Elias. And the paper that I gave there was about what were the possibilities for a kind of emancipatory politics based upon figurational sociology. Joop Hausboom said at Elias's funeral that Elias didn't work to serve any particular power. His politics were on the left, but he didn't see politics, the partisan track route of sociology, as being a route he wanted to go down. He eschewed party politics. As I understand it, he never voted in any elections either.
Disgraceful.
So he did this thing of relegating political activism to the future where we had more reliable knowledge. And he channeled his ressentiment. Obviously, he suffered a great deal. His parents were killed by the Nazis. He channeled that ressentiment into passionate detachment and also dispassionate involvement. But whether or not he took sides in political discussions through his sociology, his ideas did. And there's a lot in figurational sociology which is a profound critique of many of the things, many of the ideas that are getting recycled at the moment. Neoliberalism is a kind of case in point, the idea of the sovereign individual. There is something in Elias's sociology which is a very powerful critique. So I think one of the things I'm hoping for from this conference is that we begin to investigate some of these ways that we can rethink the relationship between Elias's work and activism. The last thought that I had also, Cass is shaking his head and it's given me a real frown, but we can talk about it. I mean, I think Elias also was a kind of activist. I'm not just talking about his Blau Weiss work or his group analytical work or the kind of work that he did with Eric, which was actually had a direct feed through to social policy. What was I talking about? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, that's it. So I recently read, because I was writing this paper with Michael on Brexit, and I recently read these two chapters in the essays volume of the collected works, where he talks about British national consciousness or something like that. The second one's really good, but the first one's a bit dicey. But it's very, very interesting. Public opinion, that's the phrase he used, because it's written in the 1960s, and this is before the first time that Britain was considering the question of whether it should be part of the European Economic Community, the EEC. And Elias said the interesting thing about Britain is that it considers itself a special case. Europe starts on when you get across the border, and that part of the reason for this is, of course, that it came through the Second World War with its national consciousness, its sense of national pride still relatively intact. And I think that's really interesting, that's really prescient. He often got questions like this wrong. He predicted that Britain would never join the European Union. He also predicted there wouldn't be an end to the Cold War. He got a lot of these things wrong when he was forced on a lot of these issues. And yet a lot of what he talked about seems to be really important now. If you look at, I was recently going back over some of the debates around Brexit and some of the names that get invoked. Enoch Powell, for those of you who don't know, this incredibly right-wing conservative politician from the 1970s. And also Margaret Thatcher. Enoch Powell also talked about Britain being a special case. He was actually anti any kind of alliance with the US or anything like that, because he saw British political institutions as being longer standing than those of our European counterparts. And Thatcher, even though she was relatively pro-EU, it came from this very paternalistic standpoint that Britain somehow, because of all its steeped in these long democratic traditions, now and then had to go into Europe and to help them get their affairs in order and to sort their house out. You can see some of these ideas coming back now. This incredible condescending, patronising notion that comes back in relation to a lot of those debates around Brexit. So I think Elias has got still lots of things to say that are very important and very interesting, and I'm really hoping we can explore some of those in this conference.
Just a quick response to one small point of what Jason has been saying. The idea that theory is a specialism in its own right, particularly what's now called social theory, which is a sort of philosophoidal mishmash. But the real point I want to make is, in Britain, I think particularly, but perhaps elsewhere as well, people who specialise in theory tend to see themselves as a superior discipline, separate from the rest, a kind of figurative House of Lords, or in the case of Tony Giddens, a literal House of Lords. And I think the most irritating thing about it is that theory as its own activity leads to this endless succession of fashionable authors, and you become irrelevant simply because your works were written a few years ago. And I think our research tradition is different, because we are actually working out and developing ideas, and we do see their relevance to empirical investigation and to political issues and so on. But it isn't just a game where you take up one theory and then another theory, and you're terribly expert on all of them, but you don't actually do anything with them.
Yeah. And Chris Rojek, a former colleague from Brunel University, and Brian Turner have referred to this tendency. It was not ornamental, it was decorative sociology.
Decorative.
And decorative sociology is where, I know this is a bit denigrative, but you do see examples of this, where you've got a relatively mundane bit of empirical research. How do you get that published? Well, what you do is you then superimpose on top of that some sort of really highbrow left-bank French theory, and you decorate it with that theory. And the problem with that is you never really test the theory, you never really develop the theory through dialogue with empirical examples. And again, it's about this idea of theory without objects.
I didn't make a mistake in referring it to ornamental. No,
I was quoting him.
I tend to speak of ornamental theory, ornamental sociology rather than decorative, because my reference it goes back to my research on food. Ronald Barthes, the structuralist, wrote an interesting little article in, I think, a women's magazine called Ornamental Cookery. But the idea is the same. He was criticising a style of 1950s cookery where bits were placed on top of a cake. You iced it and you stuck ornamental bits on it. And I think ornamental is, in some ways, a nicer word. Yeah. Sorry.
Do we have any reactions from our lovely audience? Anybody wants to add to the points we made? Or expand?
We have a roving mic.
Yes, we do.
I think what you're saying is totally bullshit. I think you are
just me or everyone.
No. I think you're stating a position which I personally deeply sympathize with. But I think there are other positions which can be linked to Elysian sociology, which are equally legitimate. When you, for instance, are saying, okay, we deal with empirical material, and we test it. Gaston Bachelard, who wrote The Philosophy of No, was very aware that you can never test a theory. A theory is based upon certain principle which this theory can justify, and it's basically a set of interrelated concepts which are developed at a purely theoretical level. Then, no, it's
that's one version of it.
Go and read Bachelard, because basically what he would say about Marx, he would say that Marx develops a set of theoretical concepts, modes of productions, different forms of mode of productions, but he's not testing the concept of mode of production. He's basically saying, can this theoretical concept I have developed in my theoretical workshop, can this be fruitful for understanding different parts of the world? But he does not test it, because the only thing which can reject a theory is the internal consistencies in the theory itself. So I personally sympathize with the position, but I think it's a little bit too hard to exclude others. Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely didn't want to exclude.
One more thing.
Oh, yes.
Every single time we have these conferences, someone is always starting the Tony Giddens slashing party. And I think Tony Giddens was totally wrong. I think he made a major mistake. I think he creates a social ontology which basically demonstrates that he is stuck in a subject-object position. So he's a complete failure. But having said this, I think he's a great ambassador for sociology, and I like him very much. That's it.
So, thanks, Lars. So definitely didn't want to preclude the possibility of other positions. In fact, quite the opposite. In fact, that the idea of a central theory is precisely that. It's the idea of a project in which you can link up different bodies of theory. You can start to tie them together. So I had an exchange with Stephen about relational sociology in the wake of Francois Delmote's death, and Francois was very active in the Canadian sociology movement, developing a group of sociologists, everybody from Dewey to analytical philosophers who have process philosophy, to figurational sociologists, to you name it, who were interested in engaging in relationships, processes, and synthesis. And there are a lot of fellow travellers along with Elias, and there's people like Steve Quilley who've done some really interesting research outside of the social sciences of parallel development. So I have no commitment to, that's exactly my point, was that Elias wasn't trying to advance a singular paradigm, but a kind of maybe a common enterprise in which you could build, not necessarily just by using aliasing sociology, but these small elements of search. That's the first point. The second point is that your idea of testing there seems to me kind of very Popperian and very philosophoidal, which is that the way that you test theory is that you look for rational forms of proof and demonstration, and that you look for internal forms of consistency. And precisely the point of talking about research theorizing is that you don't do that kind of work. You don't have this kind of static moment at which you kind of check a theory and then decide whether or not it's true or false. That kind of logical binary opposition way of thinking about theory is really suitable maybe to mathematics, but really poor when you apply that kind of logic to the social world. What Elias anticipated, I think, and he used a whole range of different terms in this connection, things like reality congruence, object adequacy, and even those terms ring alarm bells because of course they seem to involve the idea of a single intractable reality and capturing it at any one moment of time. We could have a discussion about that, but I think what Elias was talking about in that respect is successive approximations, increasing degrees of agreement between our generalized models of the world and the world thus. And that is not a project which just stops here and now through some kind of logical procedure. It is an intergenerational project of knowledge building in which over time you might be able to amend, refine, develop these more general ways in which your work, the work of or hooliganism, people working on food, whatever it is, can link up and get successively more accurate models of the world. That's a different way of thinking about testing, a completely different way of thinking about testing. And that is anathema to the idea of testing being this purely logical, rational approach.
Good. I go along with that.
I think following on from this, I mean, I think the really important thing, and that I know it's not part of this conference because I think it's really great that we're going to look at the political aspects, but sometimes, and we're internally kind of doing this, even in the discussion a little bit, maybe as an unintended consequence, is that Elias really calls out for the link between different disciplines. You know, and that's so crucial. And it would be really interesting to see in some of the papers, because I know there's a great range of papers, to see people who are working, say, as political scientists, but drawing on other disciplines. I mean, that's so crucial. Actually, that's and a little bit that I've developed in my work. But I think that's what's really more and more need to be done. Links with, and there's debate with anthropology, psychology, microbiology. There's really important relational thinking going on, and you mentioned Steve Quilly, for example, in different areas of the natural sciences. I said once to Youth Girls Fund a few years ago, I said, this is very difficult for sociologists to take on. And he said to me, Norman, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And that's the point, and that's a real challenge. So although we're trying to link the political aspects of Elias's work, we shouldn't forget, we should always try to link it to other important disciplines, some of which are having really profound debates about how we can understand the relational aspects.
I'm Arthur Bolton. I just want to strengthen this point. I want to strengthen this point. I want to emphasize it. My idea was, yes, why should a conference be devoted to Elias? We all know these terrible conferences which are devoted to this or that great thinker. I think one has to keep in mind or to accept that Elias belongs to a different age in a way that he is one of those universalist thinkers like I would think of Max Weber as another example, which are in a way not possible any longer. Because of the degree of academic specialization, amongst others. But this problem of specialization is not only a quantitative problem, it is also a qualitative problem. And Elias is, I think, convincing because he shows that one can, let's say, overcome not the divisions between the disciplines, but one can, in a way, take account of the linkages between the various disciplines. At least he was still able, to some extent, to cross the divide between sociology and psychology, sociology and history, history and psychology, psychology and political science, and so on and so forth. And as I said, these are not only quantitative differences, there are also qualitative differences because all these disciplines have developed their own theoretic theories and central theories or paradigms and methodologies, and so which makes it much more than a quantitative problem. Who can know everything about world history to reconnect the various disciplines or the problems with which they are concerned.
If I can just come back to that, I mean, I think I'm in danger of becoming sociological idealist, but there are some sort of hopeful signs in this connection to pick up on both your point and Norman's point about interdisciplinary research, where increasingly I'm finding myself as the hired sociologist on interdisciplinary bids within the university. And what I mean by that is that my colleagues in the natural sciences increasingly do research on topics that don't ostensibly seem to lend themselves to sociological analysis. And one of those recently was antimicrobial resistance. And I got called onto this team of looking at antimicrobial resistance because it turns out that's all about etiquette. It's about manners. There was a study which was done about train stations, and the plan was for it to take these kind of microbial samples and to hypothesize the kind of peak points and the kind of the conditions that would lead to a greater range of diversity of microbes being available, and this linking to kind of antimicrobial resistance. It's the resistance of antibiotics and things like that, and the conditions that generate that. And I use that as an example because increasingly the natural sciences are having to, because of the way the funding councils are going, having to take account of human behaviour. And often when they do this, they come up with quite simplistic or problematic understandings of how society works, and bringing in sociologists into the mix is often called for in that respect. But from the other side, you've got people like Vera Weiler and her work around looking at the neuroscience, the work of neuroscientists. And got a fantastic paper in Brazil a couple of years ago about how some of the work around neuroplasticity. So the popular ones are people like Antonio Damasio, Joe Ledoux, people like that, who are then filling in the gaps with, again, some quite simplistic models of social behaviour. And yet what you could do is, if you had this kind of linking up of some of this work, is really generate some very interesting insights about neuroplasticity, which seems to bear out some of the assumptions of Eliasian sociology. Could be really interesting. And sorry, just using an example from my own experience, increasingly I'm finding this I do work on addiction, and I do work on e-cigarettes, and the big debate in e-cigarettes is whether they are a gateway to smoking for young people. And the whole idea of a gateway has forced what are pretty much medical epidemiologists in the United States, can't say that word, to look at things processually. They're looking at whether young people who start on e-cigarettes then go on to smoking. And what they do is typically they don't look at it processually, they just find out that people who try stuff, and that what you really need to find out is the process and trajectories over time. So anyway, all of this to say, I think there are some hopeful signs that the institutional conditions are shifting, such that now is a good moment to explore some of these interdisciplinary links.
I think Lars Boer had a comment.
I might just repeat what Jason already said, but I think this is really, really important. And I think it kind of explains and justifies why it is so important to have conferences taking an important part in Elias's work. Because we are losing a battle these years to sociobiology. Unless we bring back the debate with theories which is sophisticated. And Elias is one of the few sociologists who has a very sophisticated view on culture and nature. And exactly, therefore, is, in my opinion, almost the only one who can be a point of departure for fighting against the, I think, incredibly danger from neuroscience and some of the hardcore sociobiological positions. Also, in addition to this, I think, as everybody here has said, the interdisciplinarity is important. I think for those of us who have been working with state formation processes, we know very well that it has been a disaster that international relations and sociology has been separated. Those who are looking at the let's say, the national habitus and nationalism issues, knows very well that if you don't include psychology, psychoanalysis, and sociology, then you have a problem as well. So the interdisciplinarity of his work is what is so important to bring together and let people deal with.
Well, I fully agree with everything you said, or almost, let's say. Well, the question was raised, I mean, do we have to organize conferences around the work of Elias? That's indeed an important question. But I would say, well, of course, Elias is kind of a symbol, I would say, or kind of label for really good sociology. But what I would like to say is the danger is that of exclusivism, that we say, well, everything is from Elias and everything which is good is from Elias, and all other sociologists or all other theories are simply not interesting, they're inadequate, and so forth and so on. So my personal position is that of openness, not only openness toward other disciplines, but also openness toward other theories, sociological theories and sociological theorists. Like, for example, the names that come up now are those of, for example, Pierre Bourdieu and Randall Collins also. And I think that's quite easy to combine with Norbert Elias's work. They're also very much relational, their approach is dynamic, and also they reject the separation of theory and empirical research. I mean, they also build up their theoretical thinking from, in combination with their empirical work. So I think these are also sources of inspiration which can be easily combined with the work of Elias and also other people. So, well, that's just my point. The plea for openness also toward other theories and other theories.
Just a jumping remark. We're all in the shit, only the depth varies.
Can I just jump back into the shit? Can I jump back just to Arthur's point? I think he's right. It is becoming impossible. You know, I think I'm someone who knows a little bit about an awful lot of things. And every so often I think, oh, that's interesting, I ought to write a book about that. And then I begin to look at the huge depth of literature that there is in that field and think, it's going to take me ages to read into this. I'm retired, stuff it. I mean, it really is quite difficult. When I started my career, back in the late 1960s, it was just about possible in Britain. It was all the strains were already being felt. I remember a friend in those early days said there should be a moratorium during which no publication is allowed to give people time to catch up. But it was still just about possible to pretend to be aware of the latest developments in a whole range of fields of sociology at least. And now I think it's completely impossible to be on top of everything. So you're left with a sort of general approach of which people have been speaking, but it doesn't enable you to come to grips with all the empirical evidence that has been accumulated by other researchers.
And I think another problem for sociology is allied to that. But no, Steve is absolutely right. It would take a lifetime of study to learn every corner of the discipline as it is at the moment. The other thing that's happened in the UK context, I don't know so much elsewhere, is that there's been this migration from the centre of sociology to all these other disciplines.
Yeah.
So what people who were previously experts or specialists on work and industry went and became sociologists of management, people, experts on education, sociology of education, went to education departments. And despite a number of times I've told my media colleagues in the School of Media Communication and Sociology that they're all really doing sociology, and it goes down well, that comment, for some reason. That they were once, sociologists of the media, sociology of communication, and they see that as a distinct specialism. So what you've had is this kind of disciplinary migration of sociology, at least in the UK context.
Tell them the story about Bob Burgess's estimate of the number of sociologists in Leicester.
Yeah. So when I arrived there, what was it? Was it 1,000? Was it all?
I think you said there appeared. I think the story is as Jason told. He's forgotten the figure. Jason was talking to Bob Burgess, who was himself a sociologist. Sir Robert Burgess, the Vice Chancellor of Leicester. Sociology at Leicester had shrunk to a very small size, hadn't it?
Yeah, it was about 15 people in the department, 16 people in the department. But he said, but of course it was about 100 sociologists at Leicester.
I think it was 80.
Okay.
But anyhow, the point is that Jason said to him, there seemed to be about 25 or 30 sociologists scattered across other departments. And Bob Burgess said, no, there aren't. I think the figure was 80. But I mean, it quantifies what Jason has been saying about the migration of sociologists into schools of cultural studies and communications and management and Uncle Tom Cobley and all.
And I think in the UK context in particular, that institutional context is becoming a real pressing concern because we are under pressure to recruit students, and we a lot of students in their droves go to do criminology now, which is seen to be less sort of wishy-washy than sociology by some, and do some of these other disciplines, definitely management. I did a stint of 5-10 years in a school of management. It was teaching organisational sociology by the back door. So that presents its own set of problems too, about the teaching of sociology and about recruiting new generations, I suppose, of sociology.
Hiya. Sorry that I was late. I'm new to the group. Jason Hughes from Cardiff University. I'm one of the migrants. I'm a professor of criminology. I'm undercover sociologist. Given that I live in some people say a post-disciplinary field of study, certainly an interdisciplinary field of study. So I just want to make a little plea about not making the barriers too easy to cross, because we might find out we've got a lot of interlopers who are actually antisocial theorists and researchers. So again, as I said, just a little plea for, that's what I'm going to argue in my paper as well, a little plea for actually remembering the old. Let's not have what Atkinson and Housley called, colleagues from Cardiff, sociological amnesia. Or indeed in criminology there's a desperate problem of what Paul Rock calls criminological chronophobia, which is a sort of fear of the old. So, we don't read Elias, we certainly don't read Weber, because they are of the past. And this obsession with the present and the post-disciplinary, I think just a note of caution about where it might take us all.
And the neoliberal, you're right, it links to the neoliberalisation. We're talking about all these interdisciplinary problems and intradisciplinary problems, and creeping up on us is this big green monster called the corporate world, which basically wants to turn universities into what's the word? Into corporations and manipulate our work so that we do their bidding. And you're quite right.
Yeah, just quickly, we have an institute on crime and insecurity that, in my view, does research for the police rather than research on the police or of the police. And I think that's an increasing tendency, presumably not just in criminology.
And you wouldn't get, would you find it more difficult to get, unlike say Michael Banton who died recently, would you find it difficult to get funding for research on the police instead of for the police?
I think if I can go back, that's a really interesting point, and I sort of kind of agree with you about the post-disciplinary thing, and I think there are kind of winners and losers in the kind of post-disciplinary discourse. Winners will always be psychology and economics, and they don't bring the sociologists out to talk about the economy either. They have economists who were complicit in the 2008 crisis.
To say the least.
To say the least. And that Harjun Chang's 23 things I don't tell you about capitalism is literally saying that they were fully culpable. So what that presents for sociologists is a question of how is a discipline taught? There's no sociology 101 anymore because of this complexity, and not even Marx favoured Durkheim is taught at quite a few institutions in the UK at least. And there aren't the kind of professional standards, and for all of its faults, the relationship between the British Psychological Association, BPS, isn't it? The British Psychological Society and psychology is a far more bounded one institutionally. It sets safeguards about staff-student ratios and about the levels, the standards of knowledge needed to be developed in order to qualify as a psychologist. And I think we don't have that. And it's partly linked to this story of disciplinary migration. So I think you raised a really interesting question.
Yeah, I always remember back in the 60s on the BBC Tonight programme, 60 years ago, someone was interviewed who was introduced by talking to Cliff Mitchell more about his, he was described as a sociologist, and it turned out that he'd just been convicted for keeping a brothel. And that seems to me a fairly clear example of failing to maintain boundaries.
That's what those standards are.
Yes. Well, if nobody wants to add something, we will close our first session.